So welcome back, everyone. We're going to get cracking. I hope you've enjoyed the morning so far. And we've now got Haresh, who works with me in Leicester, and is going to talk to you about new treatments and clinical trials. So Haresh, over to you.
I thought John was the rock star, but thank you. Let me just check if this works okay. Yeah, thanks everyone. So my name is Haresh, and I'm a clinical lecturer based in Leicester. And what that means is I spend 50% of my time being a kidney doctor and the other 50% doing some research, mainly focused around IgA nephropathy. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is really an update on new treatments and the clinical trials that are currently ongoing for IgA nephropathy. John's touched on a few of these before already, and I'm going to go into it in just a little bit more detail. I was just reflecting on how these patient days have gone over time. And John was sort of mentioning opening the treatment box and not really seeing much in there. I think really actually that developments have happened really rapidly, because I started training as a kidney doctor in 2019, and we only had one treatment, and those were ACE inhibitors really. And we're just in a very different place now. So this talk is that, I'm very excited about this really. So I thought the way I'm going to do this is I'll tell you a little bit about how IgA nephropathy works. And then based on that, we can talk about how we're using that understanding to try and treat it. So I always thought the kidneys were a very cool set of organs really compared to the others. And the reason for that is because it's got this fantastic capacity to just cope. I don't think there's very many other organs that can lose about 50-60% of their function and just crack on like nothing was wrong really. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, because while it's doing that, it is getting damaged in the background. And so picking up what's going on really early is really, really important. And John mentioned, and a few others have already mentioned about all the different things that the kidneys tend to do. And it's not just a one-trick pony really, it does quite a lot. And what's even more interesting is that all of this seems to come down to this one structure. So this is the nephron, and the kidney is made up of sort of millions of these really. And the nephron can be broken down into two parts. So broadly speaking, the first bit is the filter, which is the glomerulus, and the other bit is the tubule. So this is a cartoon of the filter. So if you cut it in half, this is sort of what it looks like. So it's essentially just a ball of blood vessels. And blood flows in through those blood vessels, and then the filter does its job. So what it does is it lets out things like extra water, salts, toxins that are supposed to get into the urine that we remove to keep the body safe. But it keeps in things like blood and protein, which really shouldn't be leaking out. So the basic structure of this filter is essentially that blood vessel wall, which is sort of red. And then just around it are another set of cells called podocytes. And they're like this extra safety net that makes sure the filter is doing the job it's supposed to do. And the remarkable thing about this is that all of this is sort of less than the width of a hair, really. It's tiny, and it's doing so much. Supporting that entire structure are those green cells that are drawn there, called the mesangial cells. And they sort of maintain the structure of the glomerulus and keeps it doing what it's supposed to do. So IgA nephropathy is a condition that affects these kidney filters. And as John mentioned earlier on, that really nice image, that immunofluorescence image showing IgA in all the filters, essentially what happens is you get this abnormal IgA, which I'll call sticky IgA, and they get stuck in the mesangium part of the filters. So what happens when IgA gets stuck into the mesangium? Sometimes actually nothing happens, and we don't really pick it up, and people go on with IgA in their kidneys without any issues at all. But sometimes you get a bit of inflammation, and that is the filter just getting a little bit irritated, a little bit angry, and it doesn't start functioning as well as it should. That inflammation can sometimes be associated with something called the complement system being activated. Now I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a few slides down, but essentially it's another component of the body's defense system, and it gets activated when it thinks that it needs to get rid of something. And in this situation, it's getting inappropriately activated. And then what happens as a result of all of this is that the kidney filter, the glomerulus, starts getting a little bit fragile. And we spoke about earlier on today about how things like controlling blood pressure is really important. And part of the reason for that is if your kidney filter isn't working very well, it gets very, very sensitive to high blood pressures essentially. And if you have a lot of high blood pressure going in there, it starts making a fragile glomerulus a little bit more fragile. And that's why controlling blood pressure becomes really important. And as a result of all of this happening, the glomerulus starts to not work as well as it should. And you start leaking a bit of blood, you start leaking a bit of protein. the protein that leaks out of the glomerulus can go into the rest of the tubule that I spoke about in the nephron, and it can damage the nephron as well. And that's why we get very, very concerned about controlling proteinuria as much as we can. And proteinuria is protein leaking into the urine. So that's sort of the consequences of this, really. But I've spoken a lot now about what happens when that sticky IgA gets into the filter, but I haven't really told you much about where that IgA is coming from. And the answer is we're still working on trying to understand where it's coming from, but we're getting there. So IgA is an antibody, and that essentially means it's a protein that the body produces to try and fight off infections. So whenever we get vaccinated, for example, our body produces an antibody response, and then whenever we get exposed to that infection in real life, those antibodies fight off that infection. So IgA is a type of antibody, and it's these particular type of cells called B cells that produce IgA. Now, what we know about IgA nephropathy is that a lot of these B cells that produce the sticky IgA, they seem to come from parts of the body that's exposed to the outside world. So that's, for example, the inside of our guts. So we know that there's now some B cells that might be living in the gut that produces this abnormal IgA, the sticky IgA, that goes and gets deposited within the filters of the kidney, and that causes the problems that I spoke about earlier on. So I've mentioned all of this to you because actually we can now start targeting each of these individual bits for treatment. And that's what the clinical trials I'm going to tell you about are doing. So let's take this in turn, really. But before I do that, actually, I thought what I'll do is just give you a quick insight into how clinical trials work, because there's different stages to clinical trials, really. So you have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and then you start looking at approvals. So a phase 1 clinical trial is when you have a drug that you think might be doing something good, but you need to make sure that it's safe, and you need to understand sort of what levels it'll be safe to use at. So phase 1 trials are very, very small trials, and they tend to just involve very small groups of people. Sometimes they're healthy, and all you're trying to do is work out whether or not the drug is safe to use and at what dosages it's safe to use, really. So very small. And then when you get promising results from that, you can move on to a phase 2 trial. Now, a phase 2 trial also is quite small. And what you do in a phase 2 trial is you get people with the condition that you're interested in treating. But you sort of look at proxy markers for whether or not the drug is working well. So for example, in the context of IgA nephropathy, what you might do is measure the amount of sticky IgA in the blood, really, or the amount of protein leaking into the urine. And then you get to a phase 3 trial. And these are the trials that really determine whether or not a drug can be used. So these are bigger trials. And as John said, there's sort of 400, 500 patients in the context of IgA nephropathy, really. And what these trials do is they tell us definitively whether or not a drug is going to work. So there was that great question earlier on about why there's been so much development over the last sort of 5, 6, 7 years or so. And as John mentioned earlier on, the two sort of main things that we look at in these phase 3 trials for IgA nephropathy is there a reduction in the amount of protein leaking from these filters? So that's a drop in proteinuria. And is the kidney function stable, usually at about 2 years or so? Once you've gone through that and you've shown that these drugs are working, you can then go through an approval process. And that approval process gets the drug to you. And that varies from country to country, essentially. But I'll tell you a little bit about how it works in the UK. So in the UK, we have an organization called the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. That's the MHRA. And what they do is they look at these drugs and they work out whether or not it's actually safe to use. So that's the first approval that's needed. Once that approval's gotten, the next thing that happens is the organization called the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence then reviews the drug. They review how much it costs and works out whether or not it's actually a cost-effective thing to use within the NHS. And once they give that stamp of approval, doctors can start prescribing it. So that's how it works in the UK. So going back to the different mechanisms of this that we can target, let's start off by talking about reducing the sticky amounts of IgA in the blood. So broadly speaking, there's 3 groups of medications we can use. So one is this drug called Kinpeygo, which is also called TRF budesonide or Nefecon. Another is a group of drugs called APRIL or BAFF inhibitors, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means in just a bit. And then you have another group of drugs that I call B-cell stoppers, and I'll tell you about that too. So let's start off by talking about Kinpeygo first. So as John mentioned, Kinpeygo is the first ever drug to be approved for the treatment of IgA nephropathy. And this is how it works. It's a very low dose steroid, but it's in this special capsule. And this special capsule, you swallow it, and essentially it works its way all the way into the small intestines, and it's designed to break down there. And when it breaks down there, it releases the steroid essentially. And those steroids work on the B cells in the gut, and it modulates how it works. And as a result of doing that, what it does is it reduces the amount of sticky IgA in the blood, it reduces the amount of protein in the urine, and it protects your kidney function. And this is essentially a screenshot of the phase 3 trial that showed that it works. And this was the first ever drug that got approved by Nephropathy. I very subtly underlined John's name there, I don't know if you saw. But this is a key figure from that paper. And there's two things about this that's important. So the blue line essentially represents people that were taking this medication. And the red line represents people that weren't taking this medication while they were on this trial. And so the first thing you can see is there's a bit of a difference there in terms of kidney function. You can see that the blue line, the kidney function, is always a little bit higher than the red line. And the second thing to say about this is that the treatment period was only 9 months long. And so once you finished treatment at 9 months, you still saw benefits afterwards too. So it's a drug that seems to work quite nicely. And this drug has been approved by both the MHRA and NICE in the UK. So it's accessible. You should be able to get it really. And this is a little bit more information about it. So right now it's really just approved for people that have protein leaking into their urine at moderate levels. And that's defined as sort of 1.5 grams roughly. But you can speak to your kidney doctors about that really. And as I said, the benefits of it is that it reduces the levels of sticky IgA in the blood, reduces levels of protein that's leaking out, and it protects kidney function. There are some side effects with it. So it is still a low-dose steroid, and there's a little bit of a spillover. So if anyone's ever been on prednisolone, some of the side effects are a little bit similar, but it happens at a much lower rate, really, is the thinking with it. And the most common side effects that were mentioned in the trial in particular were things like water retention, high blood pressure, and headaches. So these are things that need to be sort of monitored for, really. But that is Kinpeygo. So now I'm going to tell you about APRIL and BAFF inhibitors. So I mentioned that sticky IgA all comes from B cells. B cells can get activated by these other proteins that are in the body. And those proteins are called APRIL and BAFF. So what APRIL and BAFF inhibitors do is that they sort of block those proteins off. And if you're blocking your APRIL and your BAFF, you're not going to activate your B cells as much. And if these B cells aren't active, they're not going to produce that sticky IgA. That's the thinking with it, really. Now, these are the names of the drugs that are currently undergoing clinical trials for it. And I always look at these names and think to myself that there were a group of people in a room that sat down and decided they were going to call something Zigakibat and then high-fived each other and said, yes, we've got it. But yes, here we are really. So these are the 4 drugs that are currently undergoing phase 3 trials, which means we're nearly there. We're trying to see whether or not they're effective or not. So one is called Sibeprenab, and that was evaluated in the Visionary study. So that's stopped recruiting now. So they've got all the patients for it, and now they're just following it up essentially. Then there's Zigakibat, which is being evaluated in the Beyond study, and that's actually still recruiting. Then there's Atacicept, which was evaluated in the Origin 3 study, and that's in a follow-up phase. And then there's another drug called Telitacicept, which is still recruiting. The icons at the top over there essentially indicate how this drug is administered. So Sibeprenab is administered as an infusion, so it goes through the veins. The others are all given as subcutaneous injections, which means it's given just underneath the skin. So the key thing that I wanted to mention with all of this is that all of these drugs have already gone through that phase 2 trial phase. And in that phase 2, in the phase 3 trials that they went through, they were demonstrated to reduce the amount of sticky IgA in the blood. They were demonstrated to reduce the amount of protein in the urine, and they were all tolerated relatively well. So these phase 3 trials are just trying to make sure that these findings weren't all just chance findings. We're trying to confirm whether or not they're real. And that's what determines whether or not you can get approved, really. So the thing I wanted to mention about Sibeprenab is that there's actually positive interim results. So the phase 3, some of the analysis has come out and it showed that it actually works quite well. And that's really promising in terms of its chances of getting approved, really. So those were the APRIL and BAFF inhibitors. These are the B cell blockers. So there's just one currently undergoing a phase 3 trial, even though there's many more being evaluated in phase 2 trials too. So essentially what these B cell blockers do is that they just attack the B cells immediately. So they block B cell activity. And as a result of that, they reduce the amount of sticky IgA appearing in the blood. So the drug that's being evaluated is a drug called felzartamab, and that targets a protein called CD38. And that's being evaluated in a trial called the RAINA trial. And this is recruiting as well in the UK. So this is also administered as an infusion. And also, as I mentioned, with the BAFF and APRIL inhibitors, it's gone through a phase 2 study. And that also showed that it reduced sticky IgA, reduced protein, and was tolerated well. So again, it bodes well. So that is everything reducing sticky IgA. So now I'm going to tell you about the complement system. So the complement system essentially is a system of proteins. And these proteins are found all over the body, float in the blood, they're attached to some cells. And when you get antibodies that get stuck into, for example, the kidney filter, like in IgA nephropathy, some of these proteins home in, and they essentially think that that area needs to be targeted for damage because it's not supposed to be there. So it's complete misprogramming of the system. So we know that with some people with IgA nephropathy, this can happen inappropriately in much higher numbers than it should really, at a much higher level than it should. And so blocking the complement system has always been the sort of thing that we thought could work in IgA nephropathy. And we've gotten to the point in which there's drugs now that have been developed to be able to do that. So I just thought I'd put this in here because the complement system is actually really complex. And believe it or not, we sort of need to learn a lot of this for the exams that we sit really. And the reason I showed this to you is because you're going to see lots of different complement drugs, but all of them are working in slightly different ways, targeting different parts of this very complex system that's at work really. So the drugs that are currently undergoing phase 3 trials at the moment is a drug called iptacopan. So this was evaluated in the Applause IgA nephropathy study. And as John mentioned earlier on, this is actually being approved in the US. And the reason for that is because in the US, they're quite happy looking at proteinuria changes at 9 months, whereas in Europe and the UK, we tend to be more keen on looking at what's happening at kidney function at 2 years. So we need to wait a little bit longer before it gets here. And then there's the very nicely named INS-FB-LRx, which is being evaluated in the Imagination trial. So that is still recruiting. And then there's a drug called ravulizumab, which is being evaluated in the ICANN trial, and that is also recruiting. So iptacopan is a tablet, it's a capsule. INS-FB-LRx is a subcutaneous injection, so an injection given under the skin, and ravulizumab is an infusion given through the veins. So this is iptacopan, and it's essentially just showing you the data that came out from it. And what this is showing is that actually it induced a pretty good drop in protein levels leaking into the urine. So again, it shows that it works, and these are the early results of it really. And now we're waiting to see if it's also doing a good job at protecting kidney function. So that is reducing sticky IgA and the complement system. Now, glomerular inflammation, I've put it up there. Reducing the amount of sticky IgA in the blood and reducing complement activity ends up reducing glomerular inflammation. We don't have any specific drugs that target that just yet that are safe, essentially. But essentially, the hope is that attacking both those first arms will reduce glomerular inflammation. So what we're left with really is talking about the fragile glomerulus. So these medications might be familiar to you. So ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, as John was saying, they end with pril and artan, example ramipril and losartan. Then there's SGLT2 inhibitors, which are fairly recent, and these, I think many people are on these now actually from speaking to many people in the room, and examples of these are dapagliflozin and empagliflozin. And newly now, we have these new drugs called endothelin receptor blockers, and examples of them are drugs like sparsentan and atrasentan. So let's talk about these. So ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers have been approved for a very, 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 very long time for all sorts of diseases, including kidney disease. So most people who have IgA nephropathy, who have a bit of a protein leak, or who have a high blood pressure, could probably get started on one of these. Its benefits are that it reduces the amount of protein leaking into your urine, it lowers your blood pressure as well, and it protects kidney function for those reasons and more really. And the key thing to note with this is that if you do get started on this, it does drop your kidney function a little bit, but that's only because of the way it's working on the kidney filter. It doesn't mean that it's damaged the kidney in any way. So there's nothing to get alarmed about really. And the thing with this is that if you were to stop taking the drug, your kidney function goes back to where it was before. So usually what happens is a kidney doctor will start you on this and then repeat your blood test in about 10 days to 14 days time and then gauge how much of a drop had happened. And if it's far too big a drop, it might suggest something else is going on and you may have to stop it. But if it's acceptable, then you can continue it really. The other thing that it does is it can put up a salt in your blood called potassium. And some of you might be aware that potassium is something that kidney doctors can get a little bit worried about really. So if your potassium levels are high, the options are starting another sort of medication that's now available to try and bring your potassium levels down, or reducing the dosage of this or stopping it completely really. And the other thing some people complain about, especially with the pril drugs, is a bit of a dry cough. And if that happens, you can always try one of the artan drugs essentially. So then we have SGLT2 inhibitors, and this was a real serendipitous story really. So there were drugs designed to treat diabetes. So what they do is that they stop the kidney from reabsorbing the glucose that you essentially pee out. So you end up peeing out all the sugars that are in your blood. And a long time, well, I say a long time ago, sort of, in the 90s really, there were some new drugs that came out for diabetes that were approved. But then once they started being used, it was very quickly found that they actually had bad consequences for the heart. So what regulatory authorities did was they said, listen, if you're going to try and show us that drugs for diabetes work, you also have to show us that they're safe from a heart perspective. So this drug was being evaluated for diabetes, but they had to show that it was also not going to cause problems from a heart perspective. But what they actually found was that it was protective from a heart perspective. And then from there, it was actually found that it was protected from a kidney perspective as well. And so specific trials were done for kidney disease. So most people with IgA nephropathy who have either protein leak or a compromised kidney function can get started on one of these drugs actually. And it reduces protein leak, it reduces kidney function drop, and has lots of other benefits too. Like it's protective for the heart, for example, reduces blood sugar levels. Again, with this, there's a slight drop in your kidney function that's expected. And bizarrely, it seems like the bigger the drop in the kidney function, the more protective this drug is for you, actually. And again, if you come off this drug, if you see that happening, your kidney function will go back to where it was before. So they're safe drugs to take from that perspective. Because they do increase the amount of glucose that you're peeing out, there's a high risk of you getting genital infections with it. And that's something your doctors might tell you about before they start you on it. But broadly speaking, very safe drugs. And then we're left with the endothelin receptor blockers. So there's two drugs really. So there's sparsentan. So sparsentan was evaluated in a trial called PROTECT, and that's completed now. And it's got approval in the US and is going through the approval process in the UK at the moment. And then there's atrasentan. And that was evaluated in this trial called the ALIGN trial, which is now in follow-up. So these are data from the sparsentan trial, the PROTECT trial. And again, what this is showing you is essentially sparsentan was beneficial, essentially. So if you were taking just one of those ACE inhibitors or an angiotensin receptor blocker, or you took sparsentan, your kidney function, your protein, all that was much better if you were taking sparsentan. So the drug essentially works. And it's been approved by the MHRA, but it's going through the approval process for NICE. So the only way I think at the moment you can get access to this drug is if you were part of the PROTECT trial to begin with, and there's an access policy that the company has, but if not, we need to sort of wait for the NICE approvals to come through. And I thought the one thing I should mention about this is that sparsentan has an angiotensin receptor blocker in it. So if you're taking a pril or a sartan drug, ideally, well, it has to be stopped really before you can start sparsentan because that already has that drug in there. Atrasentan doesn't, so you can continue. So there's lots more going on really. And these are just the phase 3 trials that I told you about. And as John mentioned earlier on, there's phase 2 trials going on, phase 1 trials going on. And really, what I wanted to mention was, and those are just trials looking at drugs that work. But we're also doing loads of research looking into other things like the mechanisms of IgA nephropathy. And these are just a few of the things here really. So Christina spoke to you about the loin pain project, which we call the IgA nephropathy project. And she gave you that email address, and we're still trying to get people that might have loin pain so we can understand how this works. So if you have that, definitely email us and let us know and we can get you involved. Another plug is, I think I spoke to some of you about 18 months ago at the last patient day. We were talking about building a chatbot based on sort of ChatGPT and artificial intelligence to support people with IgA nephropathy. Because to me, it always struck me as crazy that you had to wait months to see a kidney doctor in clinic to have your questions answered and have to cram all of that in 10 minutes really. And what we're trying to do is we've got a panel of experts from around the world, 30 to 40 people really. And we're trying to build this chatbot that can give you accurate answers as and when you need it. And then there's Radar, which we were talking about biobanks before. Radar, anyone can sign up to Radar by signing a consent form. So you can speak to your kidney doctor about that. And what Radar does is starts collecting all your blood results and it holds it there. And we can infer so much from that information. So it's worth thinking about. And then at Leicester, we're also doing this NIHR bioresource study in which we collect blood and we try and understand how white blood cells might be causing problems in IgA nephropathy. So lots of work going on. And really, I guess that's just a snapshot of it. And what I thought I'd do is sort of come back to this summary in which, as I was saying, I don't think it was very long ago. It was just about 6 years ago in which all we had were these ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers. And now already, today, as things stand, we've got Kinpeygo, we've got SGLT2 inhibitors, and sparsentan feels like it's right around the corner, really, in terms of its approval. And it's inevitable that all these other drugs are going to become available as well. And I think this is great because, it's just another step towards us reducing the risk of kidneys not functioning as well as they should. And I think that's really important. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
previous slides, you said budesonide, 5% difference.
Yeah, sure. So kidney function, we talk about it as eGFR. And the units of eGFR is very long. It's sort of mils per minute per 1.73 meters squared. So we simplify that down and we say percentage essentially. So ideally, kidneys function at sort of more than 90%. So what they found was that if you took budesonide on average, the kidney function of people that didn't take it was 5% lower than people that did take it. But that was over 2 years. So it's sort of like a pilot changing their bearing by 2 degrees. Long term, I think it makes a big difference.
Is there a central place you can go to find out about all of the trials that are taking place?
I think it's so important. I think there's lots of no is the short answer, essentially. There's clinicaltrials.gov and there's a few other websites that are trying to list out these trials as much as possible. But it isn't there. And one of the features that we're trying to build into that chatbot is exactly that. Whenever a trial becomes active, we're going to plug that in. And so you could do it like ask a question like, what are the trials currently active in the country that I'm in? And it'll tell you. But yeah, it's something we need to work on.
What do you think would be the typical timescale from end of phase 3 trial through to, through sort of licensing and to the end of the NICE process?
Yeah, okay, so I haven't been involved directly with those processes myself. But what we have is the TRF budesonide, so the Kinpeygo. So that paper came out in 2023 as an example. And I guess we're here in 2025 and it's been approved. My feeling is that actually, we've been talking about COVID quite a bit, but since COVID happened, the MHRA in particular has really made itself very efficient in terms of how it approves drugs. So I think it's probably between sort of 2 and 3 years really, once we have all the phase 3 results that the MHRA are happy with really.
And if somebody was responding well to a trial, what happens with them? Are they able to continue with a drug before it's gone through licensing and NICE?
Yeah, so
or not?
So I know that's a fantastic question. I think actually the answer to that is you can, and I think it's a big result of a lot of advocacy that's happened from kidney doctors and patients actually. So whenever a pharmaceutical company now says they want to do a trial, I think most clinicians involved with it will say, okay, but you need to have something called an open label phase to it. And that means patients are giving up their time and they're sort of putting themselves out there to take part in this. And if they see a benefit, they should be able to get access to the drug. So being involved with the clinical trial gives you that benefit. And then exactly as Shyam was saying earlier on, even after you finish that, you can access it through their open access programs that are available really, or the access programs that are available. So yeah. Any other questions at all? If not, I'll be around, but thank you.